Well, thank you, Rosanna. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for staying up to this point of the program. The goal of this presentation is to give some of the highlights from a research agenda that we started here in the bank with Federico Huneeus, who will be co-sharing the presentation with me, Elías Albagli, as well as other co-authors inside and outside the bank, on the firm's margins of adjustment in the wake of this massive COVID shock in Chile, together with the public policies that have been deployed to counteract their effect on firms. This typical disclaimer applies. The views do not correspond to those of the Central Bank of Chile or its board members. So I guess I don't need to motivate the topic too much, especially after yesterday's great presentations. Let me just emphasize that, as Governor Marcel mentioned, Chile did not escape the ravaging effects of COVID. As you see, employment as well as GDP took a deep dive. And this happened simultaneously while several policies, large policies, unprecedented policies took place. To name but a few that are important for this presentation, public credit guarantees in loans were enacted, as well as employment protection laws that gave the chance to employers to furlough their employees. Now, more to the point of the research agenda, the aim that we've had from the beginning in the bank is to quantify the possible scarring effects of this deep contraction on firms, thinking in the back of our minds that a good understanding of these effects is what will help us understand how sustainable the recovery that is taking place will be. And a comprehensive study of such scarring effects requires understanding the ways in which firms adjusted to this shock, as well as the extent to which this adjustment interacted with some of the policies that have been enacted. So with that in mind, what is it that we've done? We've leveraged on a repository in the bank of large administrative data set of both real and financial variables, which up to recently had not been merged. And now with the merge, we can have at the firm level several dimensions, again on the real and on the financial side, together with some of the policies implemented. This has fed some of our recent monetary policy reports in September and December, and has also fostered, as I said earlier, more academic work, namely two papers that are currently being written on the topic, from which we will draw for this presentation. So the agenda for today, we're going to focus on two topics mainly. Firms' margins of adjustment in the wake of COVID. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the data that we're using. We're going to begin in terms of the margins that we're going to explore. A first margin, which is going to be a proxy for exits, so an extensive margin of firms. We're also going to be talking a lot about destruction and recall rates of productive relationships, both between firms and workers, as well as firms and their suppliers, and also a little bit about the evidence we've gathered in terms of adjustment in prices. Then the second topic is going to speak directly to the relationship of this adjustment to policies. We're going to be mostly talking about credit policies, the allocation of credit, the evidence of firms' take-up and selection into credit, as well as some of the labor policies and their complementarities to credit policies. And last but not least, we're going to provide evidence of the systematic correlation between early deployment of credit policies and credit to firms and their subsequent effects on the margins of adjustment that we will be talking about in the first section, namely the extensive margin exit, as well as employment decision, job destruction, namely. Let me compact here, let me lay out the two takeaways that we want to highlight in this presentation. One has to do with the several ways in which, in practice, firms have adjusted to this massive shock, and the other one speaks to credit as being a mitigator in this adjustment that firms have had to make. So on the various ways in which firms have adjusted, the first and clearly most painful one is exit. So our proxy for exit shows deep spikes in exit by firms, showing possible signs of large scars, scarring effect. Now, on the remaining firms that have survived, we quantified large churnings of the links between suppliers and workers. Though, interestingly, we do quantify also large recall rates on the recovery path, suggesting that for those firms, maybe the scars will not be as deep, although clearly the jury is still out on this matter. And we'll also document how some firms have resorted to increasing in prices, mostly associated with the supply disruptions that have taken place. Now, in terms of credit, as Governor Marcel emphasized yesterday, if there's one thing that distinguishes this crisis from others, is the fact that credit has been countercyclical. Now, in terms of the microevidence that we find, digging deeper into this fact, we find some interesting characteristics of these patterns of credit. First, credit allocation has been highly nonlinear, flowing to both highly affected, highly impacted firms, as well as the least affected, or the better, relatively better performance in relative terms. There is selection on net worth and productivity, suggesting potential problems of adverse selection in credit flowing, though they have been mitigated by selection on spreads too. We will explain this later. Together with some complementarities between credit and employment programs. Now, last but not least, we do find that credit in the early phase of COVID, between March and June, systematically correlates with subsequent fewer exits by firms and less job destruction. Okay, so let me say a couple of words about the data. So we're merging 4 data sets. First, the employment on insurance data set, which allows us to have a match between employers and employees. Second, and quite unique to Chile and to really most of the other advanced economies, we have a detailed firm-to-firm transactions data set through the electronic invoices that is mandatory for all firms in the economy, which allows us to see the linkages between firms and their suppliers, mainly. And we couple that with the third data set on the credit registry, which allows us to dig deeper into the credit public guarantees of the loans called FOGAPE. And also we tap into the microdata from the employment protection programs that have been enacted. This is the first margin that we quantify, the extensive exit margin. So on the top left, you see our measure, our monthly measure of non-reporting sales by firms. So this is the share of firms that in a given month we don't observe, yet we observe them in the previous month. So they don't report sales, and they no longer report sales in the remaining part of the sample. So this is a flow measure that as you see spikes in April towards 3%. If you accumulate this, given that this is a flow, if you accumulate to get a sense of the scale of firm exiting, which is done at the top of the bottom right, you see that close to between February and November of last year, it reaches close to 20% of total firms exiting. The dotted red line shows what you would see in an otherwise typical year. So to get a sense of the scale. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Federico, who's going to be talking about the second adjustment via churning.
Thanks, Andrés. So we're going to document churning of firms' relationships with customers, suppliers, and workers using the detailed employee-employee and firm-to-firm transaction dataset that Andrés mentioned before. We're going to use and build from standard labor churning measures from the literature. In particular, we're going to measure changes in the number of customers and the number of suppliers and workers that the firm has. So it's like the numerator of that expression there is just the changes in the number of links the firms have between T and T-1 divided by the average of those links between T and T-1. So this measures between -2 and 2. So it accommodates entry and exit of firms going from 0 to something or from something to 0. We're going to document 3 related measures. The first one there, destruction, which is going to be just this aggregated measure of changes in the linkages for firms that have a decrease in the number of linkages. Second, we're going to measure creation, which is the similar but sort of counterpart of that, which is just going to be the weighted aggregate measure of a set of firms that have increased the number of linkages. And then net creation, which is just the difference between creation and destruction. And we're going to weight firms when we aggregate using the same denominator of the measure that I was explaining before. Go ahead, Andrés. So here we have these measures for workers on the left-hand side and domestic suppliers on the right-hand side. So let me walk you through this. So this shows the the monthly variation of the measures that I just described since 2019. The red line is February of 2020. So you can see that in both cases, the green line, which is net creation, fell after the start of this crisis, both for a relationship with workers and domestic suppliers in terms of numbers. Well, let me first say, and the decline in the net creation is driven mostly by increase in destruction, which is the red dotted dashed line that you see. The creation sort of fell a bit, but not that much. It was mostly driven by increase in destruction. So in terms of numbers, around 20% of relationship with workers were destroyed at the worst point of all the data we have here, and 40% of relationship with suppliers were destroyed. If you do these links weighted, so remember that I was just measuring the number of links. If you weight those links differentially, then you would get that the net creation is driven mostly by a lower creation rather than a higher destruction, which sort of suggests that the destruction happened among smaller links and lower creation happened among bigger links. Also, we have documented that there's no evidence of substitution between workers and suppliers. So firms that have destroyed links, a lot of links with workers, have also destroyed a lot of links with suppliers. And we've also documented that this destruction is widespread, but very heterogeneous across sectors and firm size. And I'm gonna mention this, show this in the interest of time. But then one natural question, follow-up question is whether those links are being recovered after they're destroyed. So here we measure recall rates of both relationship with workers and suppliers. And sort of the idea here is to think about the difficulty that firms have in rebuilding linkages as a way of maybe predicting the costs of the recovery. And why we should focus on firms and not only households when we think about support during this crisis. So here what we're documenting is for each month that we have the data available in 2020, we documented the first column, the share of links that were destroyed each month. So cumulatively, if you go down, the last row says that around 22% of links of workers were destroyed between March and June. And then the second column shows the share of links that have recovered afterwards. So this is the exact same worker-firm pair that was destroyed, the likelihood of that being recovered afterwards. So you see that the overall share of links that were destroyed, that were recovered afterwards, is around 22% as well. And in terms of suppliers, that's column 3 and 4. The overall destruction of cumulative destruction of links between March and June was 74%. It's a pretty big number. But then the share of links that were recovered afterwards was around 40%. So you can see that there has been some recall rates for both workers and suppliers. It has been larger for suppliers than workers, which might suggest that the capability of adjustment on the supplier side is relatively more flexible than with workers. And kind of the next question you might have is, how does this relate to other outcomes that firms have? So here we are correlating net creation, the same measure that I mentioned before, with the inflation of October that was particularly high relative to previous months. So here we correlate at the sector levels. It's a sector level cross-sectional correlation of 160 industries that we map between the net creation measure in 2020 Q2 and October inflation of CPI. So we first find that there's a sort of overall kind of negative correlation between these two measures, meaning that in sectors in which there was more destruction, inflation was higher. But the correlation is more negative for manufacturing, which are the blue dots and the blue line, and also for suppliers. So the right-hand side graph, this correlation was larger for manufacturing suppliers than services and employment. So in terms of numbers, just to give you an idea of the magnitudes, 1 standard deviation decline in net creation of suppliers, which is around 8 percentage points, related to a 1 percentage point increase in inflation, which amounts to around 21% of a 1 standard deviation of October inflation. So this is a pretty large number, but obviously this is just a correlation. There's nothing causal here, but it sort of suggests the pass-through of the creation and destruction of these linkages to final prices. And just to know, these correlations are not significant if you look at sort of normal time, say 1 year ago. Okay, so let me go now to the sort of connect these adjustments to the policies that have been implemented. This is a graph that Governor Marcel mentioned yesterday, sort of showing that credit growth has been positive during this crisis relative to previous crises, and that's something new. It's not specific to Chile. We have documented in a companion paper that this has been happening in other countries as well. But what hasn't been shown is that the majority of the growth in this in credit stock is driven by the public credit guarantees. So if you look at September and you subtract the growth attributed to FOGAPE, the name of this public credit guarantee program, then you would almost don't have any growth at that month. Obviously, we don't know the counterfactual of what would have happened without this policy, but this is just an accounting statement. And we were sort of to understand where this credit went, we sort of correlate the credit growth with sales decline over this crisis. This is something very exciting. I mean, this is the first time we are able to merge real and financial data almost in real time. We can measure what happened last year during this crisis in terms of the mapping between credit growth and sales. And what we show here is that we sort of just account for the increase of credit growth given by FOGAPE, by the public credit guarantee policy. And we split firms into 5 groups according to the change of sales that they experienced at the beginning of this crisis in 2020. So what you can see here is that the growth has been larger for groups that have a significant decline in sales, but also for groups of firms that have a significant increase, saying that this sort of flow of credit has been going to firms that needed sort of a relatively more support, but also to firms that were sort of increasing in terms of sales. And then the smallest increase is for firms that didn't have any change in sales at all. So it's kind of a non-linear relationship between credit growth and uptake of this policy and sales variation. So sort of to dig a little bit more into selection into these policies, this is sort of part of a research agenda of what Andrés was mentioning before, that sort of digs into firm selection into these policies. This is a joint work with Mauricio Larraín and Sergio Schmuglen and Mario Vera. We document that there's an overall firms take-up of policy of around 43%. So 43% of firms use either the public credit guarantee or the employment protection program. 31% use the credit guarantee, 28% employment protection, and around 13% used both policies. So what we show here is just a cross-sectional correlation at the firm level, which in the left-hand side, we have a dummy of whether the firm took this policy, either FOGAPE in the first column or employment protection in the second column. And we just project this on a set of characteristics that we have. Again, this is very exciting. And this is the type of table in which you have the combination of real dimensions, financial characteristics, and also the uptake of these policies that firms had. So here what you can see is that there's a negative correlation between the value added per worker, so the measure of productivity of the firm, and selection into both policies. And also you see that there's a negative correlation between net worth and selection into FOGAPE. So less productive and sort of low net worth firms were the ones that were taking more this public credit guarantee policy. And in particular, also you can see that there's a strong selection in the first column in the ex-ante financial characteristics. There's a strong selection in terms of financial characteristics for the public credit guarantee, but not so much on the employment protection in the second dimension, which sort of tells you a bit about, on one hand, the self-selection that firms had based on their financial characteristics, but also the screening that banks did on these firms, deciding when they decided when to give, who to give the public credit guarantee. And in particular, we see that there's this selection on net worth and productivity suggests a potential problem of adverse selection, but some of this might be mitigated by the selection on spread, where you can see that the spread, this measure of risk at the firm level, is negatively correlated with the uptake of the public credit guarantee policy. And there's also some suggestive evidence of complementarity between these policies. The firms that were taking FOGAPE that also were taking the employment protection program. 4 minutes. Yeah. And here we have a measure of how lockdowns affected the policy take-up. So we exploit something that was discussed in the previous panel in terms of looking at municipalities that share a border. One municipality was exposed to lockdowns, the other municipality was not. And we look at firms in the boundary of that. So it's like a spatial RDD design. And we see that lockdowns increase the likelihood of taking the employment protection program at the left-hand side, but did not increase the likelihood of taking the FOGAPE program at the right-hand side. And this might be driven by the fact that when you take the employment protection program, you need to shut down at least partially. The worker has to stay at home. So when there's a lockdown, the cost of doing that is much smaller, and that's why the take-up increases. But this is sort of a evidence showing how sanitary health policies interact with economic policies.
Okay, thanks, Federico. So I'm gonna finish with one of the topics that we laid down at the beginning, taking stock of what we've done so far, what we have spoken about. We've shown quite a bit of adjustment by firms on the extensive and intensive margins, both exit and employment. we've seen increases in credit with important micro characteristics, I would say. Now we're going to have to, we're going to try to put everything together to address the question of to what extent credit was related or has been connected to this firm's adjustment. We do that in a very simple econometric setup. We're going to regress the two margins of adjustment that we aim for in this presentation. So the non-reporting sales share that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this measurement, this proxy for exit at the firm level, and wage bill growth. So these two variables, we're going to regress them on credit variables. Two, namely, two alternative ones, an intensive margin of credit, which essentially measures the change in the stock of debt between the end of February and May, and an extensive one, which is a dummy that takes the value of one if the firm had either a new loan or a refi operation, a refinance operation. In the early phase of COVID also, between February and May. The outcome variables, the left-hand side variables, are gonna aim for the later part of COVID, June, July, mainly. Okay, and we're gonna control for a bunch of variables, most importantly sales, clearly, and as well as others that I don't have time to go into the detail. Okay, so this is a snapshot of the result. Let me focus on the key thing here. For the first left-hand side variable, the exit by firms, the no report, we find a statistically significant coefficient for both the extensive and the intensive coefficient of credit. In economic terms, an increase in the stock of debt to sales of about 1% reduces the probability of non-reporting subsequently about half of a percentage point. In terms of employment, we also find a similar result. Both variables of debt, bank debt, end up being significant, and also with some economic significance. So if I hold everything else constant between two firms, one that did get a new loan or a refi operation, I will find that the firm that did this relative to the firm that didn't increase employment growth by about half of a percentage point relative to the firm that did not. We find similar results for investment, though they are left out of this presentation. So let me, I know we're on time, let me wrap up with my last slide with final remarks. So we do see evidence of firms having managed to adjust despite the severity of this shock, clearly related to some of the policies that were deployed. But there are many things that we need to carefully continue to monitor, and we are doing so in the more academic paper. One thing that we haven't mentioned at all is entry. So we know that entry is an engine of productivity. New firms bring relatively more productivity than incumbents. We're exploring this. More importantly, we are silent so far about the long-term effects of this large churning that Federico documented. So it's positive to see that recall rates have taken place, but at what cost? What are the efficiency gains, if there are, of such large recall rates? And last but certainly not least, credit has been good, but it's not a free lunch. As some of the panelists yesterday alluded, this has left us with large increases in corporate debt. Will this lead to a debt overhang? Will this curtail investment in the future? The jury is still out on these questions, and clearly they will require us to keep a focus on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrés and Federico. I am looking for the question, and there are two questions. Ernesto has a question. Can you give the voice speaker to Ernesto?
Yes, Ernesto
Hello?
is unmuted.
Okay, thank you very much, Rosanna and Sofia, and for the presentation. I have two quick questions. One is about the word destruction, whether it's capturing really suspension of labor or supply relationships, and also about the word exit, whether it's also capturing some firms that get freeze for intentionally freeze. And I'm asking this because the word destruction and exit may be a little bit too strong, and because it conveys an idea of, in some sense, inefficiency or some difficulty to resume activity later on, as opposed to suspension or freeze, which probably is easier. And related to that, I know that the paper covers a lot already, but I would like to ask whether the authors have some conjecture about inefficiency in the response of the firms as opposed to efficient response to the COVID shock. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Let me take the lead here. So yeah, it's a good question, and it allows us to clarify something that we passed by on the fly on the measurement. Yes, we're not using destruction, perhaps is too strong of a word. What we are looking at in the data is firms that reported sales and at some point stopped reporting, right? And have no other, we could see other activity on the firm if they are buying from suppliers, which is something that we're also exploring, and if they're buying intermediate goods. So these firms might be dormant, as you say, but they might wake up, right? That is clearly a possibility. We do try to control for the historical recovery of these firms, right? That eventually go out and return. But this is clearly not too informative given the extraordinary shock that we're witnessing. We have explored firms that we call in hibernation, which is firms that continue to sell goods and services, but at a very, very low capacity, right? To try to account for this other margin. But clearly it's something that we could refine in subsequent presentations. Now, in terms of efficiency, yes, this is another goal, which is to quantify this large churning that has taken place together with the recall rate. What has that implied in terms of, say, productivity at the firm level, right? Do the large recall rates allow for productivity to bounce back, or not as much as pre-crisis?
Thank you. Then we have Carlos Madeira, who wrote a question in the panel. Carlos.
Thank you, Rosanna. I wanted to ask a question to Federico and Andrés. Does the recall rate of the workers consider those that are in the employment protection scheme? Meaning, are those workers a link that ends and is then recalled after a few months? Or maybe those workers are not observed as an end in the link? And I also wanted to ask a question about which type of workers are ending the relationships with the employers. Thank you.
You want to take this or?
Yeah, no, I can take it. Thanks, Carlos. So on the first question, so workers that are on the employment protection program still appear in the data set. So the destruction relationships wouldn't take that into account. So those relationships would appear as being active in the data set. So that's not taken into account both in the destruction and also not in the recall rates, the way we are measuring it. And then on the heterogeneity on workers, I think that's something very interesting and relevant. We haven't done that very specifically, like in detail. But I can say what I said before, which is it seems to be that the destruction has been more small relationships. It's a work relatively low wage, which is probably related with the tenure of the worker and maybe the education. And the decline in the creation has been driven also by workers that are paid higher wages. So that's probably correlated with tenure and education as well. So that's what we have done so far, but I think we need to dive a little bit more deeper into selection of different types of workers into both creation, destruction, and I think that's
There are two other questions from Mario Gonzalez and Juan Francisco Martinez, and I think that will be the last one to go to the other presentation.
Hey, hi, thanks, Rosanna. Thanks for the paper, Andrés and Federico. When you were going through the presentation, you specifically mentioned, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that you saw an important supply effect on the October inflation, if I remember correctly. Have you explored the possibility, or have you interacted, or how do you explain that the main effect of that inflation measurement was due to supply effects and not due to demand effects, given that we have had the withdrawal of the funds from the pension funds?
Yes, so no, that's a very good question, Mario. So we're not, to be completely transparent, we're not yet at a stage where we can definitely identify separately supply and demand shocks. Let me be completely transparent here. Surely there must be some demand factors or elements behind this. We are nonetheless finding that these, as Federico showed, that some of these goods that are produced by sectors in which more net destruction has taken place do see a bit of in relative terms, a bit of an increase in prices relative to others where such destruction has not taken place. So suggestive of some of these supply side effects. But we are not at a point where we can definitely pin down this from demand.
Can I add something small? Thanks for the question. I think if you were to if you were thinking that some of this correlation is driven by the demand shock of the pension retirement funds, then maybe that would make our statement a bit more stronger, right? Because you would think that the demand would sort of help creation and sort of boost those sectors, and therefore sort of taking that out might make the negative correlation even steeper, right? Because it's just an effect on demand, on prices, and also a positive effect on creation. Then the places that were more destruction would sort of be more correlated with increase in inflation to make it sort of consistent with our graph.
Okay. Elías, do you want to say something else, or we can go to the other presentation? It's okay?
No, I think Andrés and Federico have made impeccable presentations and answers, so there's nothing left for me to add.